Are you really sure you'll be okay going alone, Sarah?
I told you, it's fine.
Can you handle the job interview on your own?
I know the place.
But,
Today was the long-awaited interview at Sarah's dream company. Even though I was eager to get to the interview venue, my mother, who had come to see me off at the entrance, kept asking out of worry. I was getting impatient with her repeated questions. I told you, I'm fine. I'd been to that place many times before. After hearing this firm response, my mom finally stopped pressing me.
yes, I remember. We used to go there together a lot. You'll be fine on your own now.
Yeah, I've always admired that place and decided that I would definitely work there. Watching Sarah, her mother nodded with tears in her eyes.
I'm proud of how I raised you. You've got this. Just show them what you've got.
Looking down at her suit, Sarah remembered its significance. This suit had a lot of sentimental value. It was what her mother wore when she was younger. When I was little, after my father had passed away due to an illness, my mother crafted this suit herself. Facing the need to support the family in the absence of my father, my mother, with little money, started job hunting. Without enough money for job hunting, she sparingly bought the materials and made this suit herself. Her mother, wearing that suit, worked hard for my sake. I love her for that. Wanting to be like her and hoping to repay her kindness, I had asked to borrow that very suit. Thanks for letting me borrow it. I feel empowered wearing it.
You're being dramatic.
I'm serious. I'm not exaggerating. While I chuckled at the comment, Mom, with a stern look, grabbed me by the shoulders.
Listen, if anyone bullies you, you tell your mom, okay? I'll take care of them for you.
Sarah smiled wryly at her overprotectiveness. Come on, it's time to let go, Mom. My mom was always so worrisome. During my middle school and high school days, she would express such concerns time and time again. Look, I have to go now. Don't you have a business trip today, Mom? Once I leave, you should head out too, okay? Hearing this, Mom, seemingly having forgotten, hurriedly checked her wristwatch.
Oh no, look at the time. I'm not prepared at all. What do I do?
There's no time to panic. Get ready quickly.
Right, you should get going too, Sarah. Take care.
Saying this in a rush, Mom ran around the house in a flurry. While Mom was a successful career woman, she also had these whimsical moments which were a bit of a headache. Watching her antics, I sighed and finally left the house saying, I'm off now. Upon arriving at the company, I waited in front of the interview room. Next, please, came a voice from behind the door. I checked my suit one last time, took a deep breath, and said, excuse me, as I slowly opened the door. Inside, 2 interviewers awaited. One was an older gentleman. The other is a young woman. The woman was breathtakingly beautiful. She had striking features and glossy hair that went down to her waist. Even her suit seemed to shine. Although I didn't vocalize it, I thought, wow, she's so gorgeous. While lost in the spot, a cold voice from the young woman said, could you hurry up and come in? Oh, yes. I reflexively answered and walked up to the chair placed in front of the interviewer. Did I mishear something? I feel like I just heard a cold voice from this beautiful interviewer. No, it must have been my imagination. Right, this is an interview. I can't imagine an interviewer of all people using such harsh words. As I was reassuring myself, the beautiful interviewer opened her mouth.
Name.
Excuse me.
I said, give me your name.
It wasn't just my imagination. That cold voice earlier was indeed from this beautiful interviewer. Overwhelmed by the interviewer's icy tone, I hurriedly responded. I'm Sarah Smith. Thank you for taking the time to see me today. I look forward to the interview. After my lively introduction, the male interviewer offered a kind please have a seat with a gentle gesture. Thank goodness, this male interviewer seems much kinder than the beautiful one. I courteously said, thank you, before taking my seat. Then, the male interviewer started speaking with a smile. My name is Mr. Williams, and I'll be in charge of this interview. Mr. Williams glanced awkwardly at the beautiful interviewer as he introduced himself. Noticing his gaze, the beautiful interviewer slightly furrowed her brow.
My name's Mrs. Johnson.
So, the beautiful interviewer's name was Mrs. Johnson. Feeling tense, I greeted, "It's a pleasure to meet you." Noticing my nervousness, Mrs. Johnson looked at me with a snort of amusement. She then scrutinized me.
Do you even know what kind of company you're applying for?
Caught off guard by the unexpected question, I quickly adapted. Yes, I understand that your company is one of the leading fashion corporations in the U.S. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that many of the fashion trends in the U.S. originate from your company. Hearing this, Mrs. Johnson smirked, commenting, exactly. Although her eyes didn't share the humor. Could it be? I wondered. Am I undergoing a stress interview? But when I looked at Mr. Williams, he seemed distressed but didn't seem to have the courage to confront Mrs. Johnson. Perhaps that was why. Mrs. Johnson wore a mocking smile, appearing to be in complete control of this interview.
You really came dressed like that, knowing how big our company is.
What do you mean by dressed like that? That's cute. What's up with it? She pointed at my attire. I quickly looked down. Was something out of place? But everything seemed fine. Is there something wrong with it? She burst out laughing.
Ha ha ha. Seriously, you don't see it? Okay, let me help you. First off, those buttons. What's up with that design?
They have an original logo on them.
How outdated. And that white bow tie, you think that's cute?
It came with this suit. No matter what I said, Mrs. Johnson just laughed mockingly. Feeling defeated, I looked down. Seeing my distress, Mr. Williams, who seemed to be feeling sympathetic, gave Mrs. Johnson a concerned look. Maybe you should stop, he said with a shaky voice. Mrs. Johnson shot him a fierce glare.
You know, with a position lower than mine, you shouldn't be speaking out of turn.
What? Isn't Mr. Williams in a higher position? I was shocked when he said that, and then Mrs. Johnson turned her gaze back to me. She smirked. Well, if you're wondering what I'm getting at. She paused for dramatic effect, then gave me a condescending look.
You're dressed like an old-fashioned grandma.
After stating that bluntly, Mrs. Johnson laughed heartily.
I guess it suits an ugly woman like you.
Dressed like an old-fashioned grandma. Hearing those words, I thought to myself, this is just too much. It wasn't because I thought I had failed this interview. I lifted my face and took a deep breath. Then I asked Johnson something. Would you mind taking back what you said?
Take back? Why, it's true, isn't it?
Watching Mrs. Johnson laughing, I let out a disappointed sigh. Seeing this, Mr. Williams also seemed distressed. I see. That's too bad. Since Mr. Williams was aware, I thought you'd know too, Mrs. Johnson. At my words, one of Mrs. Johnson's eyebrows twitched. This suit. Taking a deep breath and collecting myself, I responded.
What about it?
It was tailored by your company's CEO, you know. Hearing this, Mrs. Johnson looked utterly surprised. What? She seemed frozen for a moment, then her face contorted.
What are you talking about?
She was clearly flustered. Just as I was wondering what to do next, I heard a door open loudly behind me. Turning around, I saw my mother. Mom, why are you here? Weren't you on a business trip?
I thought I wouldn't make it, so I canceled. I was worried about you, Sarah, so I came to the office and was eavesdropping from the next meeting room.
With a big smile, my mother answered, making me let out a sigh of disbelief. That's not okay. Wasn't it a meeting? And I told you not to follow me.
Well, the HR director told me it was fine, and let me use the meeting room. Besides, I left everything to Mr. Miller.
That's not the point. Don't just dump everything on Mr. Miller just because you're the vice president. You're putting too much on him.
Oh, he gladly said, leave it to me.
At a loss for words, I sighed heavily. While I was having this exchange with my mother, Mrs. Johnson looked lost. On the other hand, Mr. Williams stood up and bowed deeply to my mother. Thank you for your hard work, Mrs. Smith. Mr. Williams was greeted with a light wave and a smile from my mother. Then she turned her smile towards Mrs. Johnson, although her eyes weren't smiling.
You're Mrs. Johnson, right?
Facing my mother, Mrs. Johnson turned pale as if she had seen a ghost.
What did you say about my daughter's suit?
She's your daughter. With a common name like Smith, I didn't realize. Ignoring Mrs. Johnson's attempt to deflect, my mother pressed on.
Answer the question. What did you say about my daughter's suit?
Finally, with a voice as soft as a mosquito's buzz, Mrs. Johnson replied.
I said, it's old-fashioned and makes you look like a grandma.
My mother, still smiling, nodded in acknowledgement.
It seems you're not familiar with this, Mrs. Johnson, so let me, the founder and CEO, explain this suit to you.
Mrs. Smith began.
This suit was used as the model for a certain popular brand of ours.
With that explanation, Mrs. Johnson quickly lifted her bowed head.
Yes, Johnson, the one you're wearing right now. It's strange. Any of our employees should recognize my daughter's suit at first glance.
Indeed, what the mother said was right. Mr. Williams knew. He knew what suit I was wearing.
This suit, all its design, was my idea. The original logo imprinted on the buttons is a precursor to our company's logo, and the white ribbon paired with the suit was a trendsetter at that time. You don't even know the company's history. Even if you're good-looking, it seems your knowledge isn't fit for our company.
Please, wait. I didn't know. Please, can you forgive me?
Ignorance doesn't cut it in the real world. It's common sense for professionals to always be learning. Well, I'm not entirely heartless. If you didn't know, then I'll forgive you as long as you study more about it.
Mrs. Smith's words lightened Mrs. Johnson's face.
Thank you.
However, the relief was short-lived.
But that's if the only thing you disparaged was the suit.
What?
It wasn't just the suit you belittled, was it?
When Mrs. Smith said this, Mrs. Johnson's face went pale, recalling something. Mom, maybe it's enough. I tried to intervene, but my mother was visibly angry. From my past experiences, when she gets this angry, there's no stopping her.
You called my daughter ugly, didn't you? How do you plan on explaining that?
I felt pity for Mrs. Johnson, looking so pale in front of the CEO, and tried to defend her. Mom, I'm not bothered by it, and if I'm being honest, it's true. But she retorted sharply, that's not the point.
Johnson, maybe you don't understand because you're young, but your own child is the most precious and the most beautiful thing in the world to a parent. Because they are dear to you, you can keep pouring out unconditional love, even in the toughest situations. I've always showered my child with love. Who wouldn't be offended if someone insulted their cherished child?
Mom, that's right. Growing up without a father around, my mother always took care of me. She always loved me. Because of this, she always told me,
listen, if someone bullies you, you tell me, all right, then I'll go and set them straight.
Now was that time. My mom was trying to stand up for me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I felt my mom's deep affections for me. Mom asked Mrs. Johnson in a gentle voice.
Weren't you raised the same way, Johnson?
When posed with this question, Mrs. Johnson, perhaps reminded of her own parents, showed a sudden realization. Making up his mind, she looked into my eyes and slowly bowed his head.
I'm so sorry.
Seeing Mrs. Johnson like this, my mother seemed to feel a sense of closure, letting out a deep sigh.
I'll let you off with a demotion and a transfer. The demotion will be followed by a transfer from the headquarters, so it's a pretty significant move.
Perhaps hit hard by this decision, Mrs. Johnson replied dejectedly, I understand.
Your new location, let's see, Johnson, you'll be going back to your hometown.
This appears to be unexpected. Facing the CEO, Mrs. Johnson shows a surprised expression. Seeing Mrs. Johnson's reaction, Mom let out a chuckle. This time, her eyes sparkled with genuine amusement.
Go back home and take care of your parents.
The warmth of Mom's smile must have melted her heart. Mrs. Johnson finally showed me a genuine smile.
Yes, yes, thank you so much.
In the end, the interview for that day was postponed, and it was decided to reschedule for another day. When I interviewed again, I was successfully hired at my mother's company on my own merit. Having finally achieved my long-time dream of working for the company, I had a request for my mother. Mom, at work, please treat me not as your daughter but as a regular employee.
Of course, I am the CEO, after all. I can't show everyone my motherly side.
I felt relieved at her response, but only for a moment. But she hesitated. But what? I had a bad feeling about this. Whether she knew my concerns or not, she said,
If someone ever bullies you, you come tell me, okay? I'll set them straight for you.
At my mother's predictable line, I could only sigh and say, I knew it. And then I responded with a line of my own. Come on, it's time to let go